Hello, and welcome back to Leadership Trailblazers. I'm delighted today to welcome Caroline Hughes as our guest. Caroline is a leadership consigliere, and she is the founder of Conscious Leadership Development, and she works with senior leaders at the moments that really matter and with senior leadership teams, helping them to find the capacity that they didn't know they had. Caroline's also been a global corporate leader, so she's going to bring that experience to our conversation today, as well as her consultancy experience. So welcome, Caroline. It's really lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Lois. Delighted to be here.
Wonderful. So, as you know, Leadership Trailblazers is all about that the way that we led yesterday won't lead us into tomorrow, and digging into what are the things that leaders really need today? What are the skills and the qualities they really need? What are the challenges they face? So if we could start with your thoughts on what do you think the qualities are that leaders today really need to succeed?
Sure. I think, Lois, before we talk about the leaders themselves, we got to talk about how the dynamics of work are shifting and changing.
Yeah.
You know, like sometimes feels like we're living in this, I don't know, live incubator for change that seems to never go away, doesn't it? And we thought with COVID, once we all got back into the offices or, you know, we stopped social distancing, that suddenly we'd go back to the way things were. And I think nothing has been less true. But I suppose I kind of see it through a couple of different lenses. I think firstly, the younger generation that's entering our workforce today are less inclined to ask, well, what do I need to do to belong in here? And they're more inclined to ask those more kind of disruptive questions, aren't there? And why do we do things this way? You know, I've grown up with technology. I've gone through college with AI getting more and more integrated into the learning experience. And we often find that their experience of the world of work is maybe a lot more antiquated than what they might be used to. So I think that's one of the kind of factors that's putting some pressure in the system. And I think the second thing, I think particularly becomes more apparent at a leader and senior leadership level is, of course, that pace of change that accelerated so much, I think kind of in conjunction with the COVID period, but not exclusively so. It just hasn't gone away. Sure, it hasn't. I mean, we still expect the more with less mantra will suffice. And coupled with that, you've had quite a lot of middle managers getting stripped out of organizations through various rationalization programs. So we've got hybrid work, we've got a new mindset around what it means to be a good colleague and a good employee. And you have this kind of really increasing level of demand and complexity landing on leaders' shoulders. So it can be very easy to feel that it's all on one or three or five people in an organization, maybe called an executive team or maybe called a senior leadership team in a function. And that assumes the leader, of course, is good at delegating. So I think you're asking me about skill and capability. So I see it kind of through, if we look at how world of work is changing. So if we look at it through three lenses then, so we have this changing kind of expectation of what it means to be an employee. We have this bigger demand profile, and then of course leading hybrid teams. And it kind of would be easy to say, well, this is about becoming higher performers. This is about doing more of the more with less. But I actually think kind of the qualities we're looking for in leadership today is more about, firstly, their personal resilience to be able to withstand all these factors. Secondly, it's about how do we build resilience into teams so that performance is sustainable? And I believe that's more about how we help people to feel like they belong at work, to really work through issues around trust and productivity that naturally arise in this more hybrid work experience, which can easily tend to be transactional rather than relational. And so I think there's the rise of the relational leader, I think is what we're probably about to now see coming in more and more to organizations.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Caroline. And it's interesting that you referenced, you know, the kind of the changing mindset around work and that the interface of AI, but that actually human relationships are becoming even more important.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you said, in terms of the younger generation asking some of those deeper questions. Do you think that there is more emphasis on the younger generation wanting to know what the social purpose is now in leadership?
I think the younger generation are probably bringing that conversation to the fore. I think it's been there already. I think if we think about the millennial in particular, which are now, I suppose, at mid-career, I think that question around purpose and intention has very much been top of mind for them. And we've seen organizations that have really kind of experienced some challenges where there's been a gap in the rhetoric between what the PR says and then what's the lived experience in the organization. And I think if we look at the so after the millennials, it wasn't the Gen Z, it's Gen Z, isn't it? Right. And then they're kind of coming in going, well, yes, and we also have a different expectation of work. So show me how my work has meaning. So yes, company purpose is one part of the conversation, but then how is it that what I do connects to something bigger than the job, the task? And I think that word connection is something we might keep coming back to kind of as a theme through our conversation, because it certainly comes up for me in my work, whether it's with a team, whether it's a leadership team or a leader and his or her team, around going, how do we create meaningful connection and beyond the purpose statement, beyond the poster on a wall that says, you matter, the work that you do matters. And together, this is how we contribute to something that is bigger or is in service of a bigger mission. So I kind of see it on those three dimensions, Lois, as this conversation kind of becomes more prevalent.
Absolutely. And you probably experience this. I certainly experience this in my work, that actually with the rise of hybrid working, how do leaders actually ensure that they are staying connected to their people? Because as you say, I think that connection is so important. And then the connection to the values of the company, the purpose of the company beyond that. One of the things I've certainly noticed, and I often talk about, is that I think that people want to know more about who a leader is rather than just what they can do. And would you agree with that?
I absolutely would. I'm kind of smiling on the inside here, Lois, because my favorite question to ask a leader is, why should anyone be led by you? And it's typically the question that causes the eye contact to drop or suddenly the ceiling to get very interesting. Right, because it's a very short question, but that kind of, it requires an answer more almost than it used to, like I remember reading this book by a guy called David Pearl, and I don't know if you've come across this book. It's called Storytellers for Leaders, and it begins with this chapter, and it starts off by saying, once upon a time, there was a great leader in a sharp suit that sat behind a desk. And he, because it was typically he, told people what to do, and the people went away and figured out how to do what he said, right? And then came this quest for meaning and purpose. And suddenly, now the leader behind the desk has got to rely on a different set of tools to the I've got the answer, how do you do what I say it needs to be done? And I think we're quite far way away removed from that in one sense. And I think we're still in it in another, right? And this question of when you're not the person who has all the answers, especially then, why should anyone be led by you, comes down to a question of personal values, comes down to what do I stand for as a leader that I am consistently demonstrating. And I think our teams determine whether or not we're really being honest when we answer the question. Because it's really easy to say, oh, yes, of course, I'm a man of integrity, or of course, I'm a woman who does all the right thing. But if we're not demonstrating that day to day, I call them the pivot points of daily life, where, we might be inclined to act one way if it was only us, but actually in service of the role that we have, the team that we have, our place in society, it places a bigger calling on us to act differently. And can we step into that with integrity of not knowing exactly how it's going to go, being vulnerable around, actually, I'm going to back myself here to lead through this, whatever it might be. And allowing kind of the narrative to evolve and change through that. Because I think otherwise people don't know who they're following. And I can go on Instagram and I can think that I know whoever it is I'm following, very deeply and intimately. I love Simon Sinek. And I think when I listen to him, I hear who he is. And what if I'm in an organization, am I giving my team the same experience of me?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Because whether I say it or whether it's in the way that I show up every single day in these pivot moments, the ones that really matter, where there's a tough decision, where the pressure's on, where somebody somewhere really needs whatever it is, am I stepping forward in a way that is in alignment with who I say I am? Or am I pretending that those private moments don't matter?
Yeah. That I think really sums this up, because I see this time and time again. And if people see the disconnect, then actually what happens is the trust completely goes.
That's right.
And, and then it's really very, very hard to regain. So, and leaders are more visible than they used to be. We've got social media, we've got, all sorts of forums where leaders are much more visible than they used to be. So those private moments don't really stay private anymore.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
So I'm wondering again, just kind of following on from that, what are the real challenges that you see for leaders in terms of actually, as you say, being able to get people to want to follow them?
Here's a couple of things that come to mind. I'm working with a team at the moment who, on paper, look like a great team. They can finish each other's sentences when it comes to strategy. They're really clear when it comes to the KPIs. And actually, initially, when they brought me in to work with them, it was let's make sure we're all, heading into 2026, knowing exactly the direction of travel. And I observed them in one of their meetings, and then I had some one-to-ones with the team. And I said to the leader, I said, to your credit, this team is very much on the same page about your strategy. They're quite clear on what you're about. He has a particular mantra. I said, they're telling me it in all of them. They're actually really clear on that. But what they're not clear on is, or what they're not maybe leaning into more, is how they interact beyond this monthly one-day meeting and a once-a-week meeting. So actually, this is not a team. This is a meeting. And I don't know if you see this in your work too.
Oh,
Lois,
absolutely.
right? Where
it's
the Monday clearinghouse meeting for the hour, or it's the full day off-site, or it's the 2-day deep dive, or whatever it is. But in between those interventions, there's either limited coherence in the work that gets done. There's maybe very challenging interactions that gets in the way of work being done. And I think this is kind of going back to what I said about the rise of the relational leader in the context of this bigger demand profile that is upon everyone. I kind of sat with him and I said to him, are you up for leading this? Because it's really easy to run a strategy session, even though there's nothing easy about getting 10 people on the same page, right? There's nothing easy about it really. But when we really start looking at, let's look at what's truly getting in the way of your peak performance. What's the thing that's going to make the difference to whether or not you meet this, falling over the finish line, or you meet it with energy in your tank and being up for whatever the next challenge is, because it doesn't stand still. And I think for leaders to really have capacity and tolerance to step into that messy middle of human dynamics and create space for the conversations that will actually make the difference to, firstly, people's experience of work, and then secondly, the efficiency with which work can actually get done when we don't have all this unspoken stuff, that's built up over years, that everybody has learned almost a circuitous language so that we all nod and we know what we're talking about, but we never say what it really is, right? And I deeply admire the leaders who step into that and who call their teams to almost a higher way of being because they're in this team called leader, right? And a kind of shift beyond the requirements of the function of the team, and then shift into actually leader, like what I call true leadership, which is messy, and you have to be bad at it before you get good at it, because there's very few who kind of come ready-made out of the wrapper.
Absolutely.
Right? Typically,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Typically, leaders are typically promoted because they are very good at something, and they show potential to be even better at something. And through that, they can pass on knowledge and wisdom to their teams. But the actual skill of teaming, the actual artistry of bringing a group of people with you, not because you've got a cool mantra or a sticky phrase, but that actually lights their ambition for, it's calling me to something bigger and different, that I can then use as my circuit breaker when I want to do something quicker, faster myself, and I don't want to delegate it on, or I've got to make the phone call to the colleague with whom I have a testy relationship, or the colleague who always seems to have their act together and I never feel good enough when they are presenting or calling out what they're doing, right? So this bringing common language around the standard of being part of this team, the what does it mean to lead here? I think that's where leadership really has to now begin to step into that, because technology and tooling is going to take care of a lot of the expert stuff that we used to rely on the people for. It used to be the critical experience that would get us promoted in the past. And I've been well around talent management processes where it's hard to go beyond the rosy hue of the technical expertise, because we've deeply valued that, and we should value that, absolutely. But this capacity to lead with and through others requires almost a slower pace of leadership to allow kind of behavior to shift, to change, and to embed.
I think it's really interesting when you talk about that messy space, because I think that's a big challenge for many leaders. They don't like mess. They actually want things to get done and move forward and all of those things. But as you say, that is not leadership. That's performance. And they are two different things. I love your expression teaming. I think that's great, and the artistry of that,
because it is messy, isn't it?
It is messy. It is.
I'm looking at some of this. What I'm learning now. So I'm 6 years out of my corporate professional life, and I know it is futile to say if I knew then what I know now, but I do frequently find myself going, did I pay enough attention to the human dynamics? Because in my style, because I'm quite introverted, and my style would have been very heavy on one-to-one time, very deep in terms of development. And I would have said I was a good team leader. I would have kind of gone to the bank going, I invest in my people in a very meaningful way. And I still think that is true. But when I look at it then through the teaming lens and moving beyond common purpose, because again, I think my team would have been a bit like that example I just gave. They would have said, yeah, we know where we're going. We're right people, right place, and we fit into company. We kind of were good on that. But did I encourage the right level of interaction outside of my direct involvement? Did my inner fixer, if you like, take a back seat for long enough to tolerate the discomfort of knowing, well, if I put 2 of the team doing that directly together, it might take 3 weeks instead of 2. And can I bear it? Can I bear it to wait the extra? Do I have it? And if I don't have it, what is it? How is it that I need to set that task up for success in how I delegate, in how I give authority, in how I put some guardrails around it? Like that's where, I had to kind of step back and say, I wasn't great at that, actually. I had a version of it that wasn't awful. I kind of think that. I really hope my team listens to that. They might say, okay, it wasn't awful, right? However, when the more I hear that pattern in leaders, like what I was stuck in going, yeah, but well, like, what time do you call this with your, 3 weeks instead of 2? I needed it yesterday, right? So putting the team first as a mindset, what I find, again, and it's an over time thing, right? You want to be a multiplier leader. And I've been really heavily influenced by Liz Wiseman's work on multiplier mindset. And I love it in terms of you're an accidental diminisher. I love the language of that, because as soon as we hear multiplier, well, yes, of course, I want to go forth and multiply, and anyone in my team is going to reach their potential and they're going to thrive and we're going to hit our, of course. I've never met a leader who didn't want to do that. Really never met one. But actually, are your ways of working, your own habits, are they actually getting in the way of that? And I think sometimes, particularly, we've got go-to guys, don't we, in every organization, and indeed go-to gals, right? And very often they're senior people. And very often they're the team leader, the function leader, they're the person at the XCOM table, right? And that is such a barrier to multiplying. And it's only when you go, well, what do you mean? If my boss is asking me for the answer, am I not honor bound to give my boss the answer? Sure. That's fine if you're the technical expert sitting around the table. But as a leader with a function of 100 people or a team of 15 people, or you have managers of managers who report up into you, whichever it might be, your primary job is to develop them and to put your protocols in place so that the answer can come back up to you without you being the person who's got to go work your way through the spreadsheet and spend the 5 extra hours and then, of course, throw the eyes up and go, I just don't have people who do that. I must need more people. I must need new people. But that mindset of being the go-to is actually it's a big part of the challenge, because we'll only ever see it as our jobs until we start going, actually, I'm not really a go-to, because that suggests I'm more like a traffic light. I'm a red light or I'm a green light. But what if this is, oh gosh, the traffic analogy, this could go a bit ropey, so bear with me, Lois.
Okay.
What if I was a roundabout with a number of different exits? And depending on the nature of the question, I can direct people to the appropriate exit, to either self-serve, or I can put my traffic controls in place that instruction gets down there quickly, and it returns to me if I'm the person on the hook, because I'm going to sit in that senior meeting or that executive forum or that expert group, whatever it is. So how do I make my team work in service of the outcome?
I love the metaphors. I absolutely love the metaphors, and I do think that being that go-to person, it is a barrier, and it's a hard one to let go of.
It is, absolutely.
In one of the episodes that I've done previously, I talk about the art of saying no, and really thinking about what do I need to do, what really needs me, and actually what should and could be others. But it's a tough question for many leaders.
It is, because it's entity, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And right. Where does my value go if I'm not the one delivering?
Yes.
Yeah,
that's right.
It is a really tough one, and I think it's fascinating that you said you were asking yourself some of these questions. as a result of your experience working with other teams at the moment. One of the things that I think, again, is quite difficult is who gives the leader that feedback. Leaders, I think, have to get good at asking themselves those questions. But, the more senior you are, the less people give you really good, honest and constructive feedback. And I remember one of my mentors years ago saying that, organizations that are feedback poor are often going to be poor in terms of actually getting the most out of their people. Because if you're not getting that feedback, then how are you going to know how well you're doing? So any thoughts on how leaders can get feedback and how they can create an environment where people feel it's safe to give them really good feedback, honest feedback?
Yeah, I think safety is such a primary concern, isn't it? I read this distinction recently, which I found really helpful. And it said something like this, that trust is developed at the individual level. And safety, particularly psychological safety, is the collective responsibility. And I hadn't really thought about it in that way before, Lois. And I read, I think it was an article last week I read. So it's kind of really fresh for me here around. I have plenty of clients, indeed I've worked in organizations who've said safety is our number one value. And that meant things like you park your car in reverse, you put your lid on your cup before you walk with a hot liquid, or as often happened to me, teetering around in my 4-inch heels, laptop in one hand, notebook in the other, going up the stairs, and somebody would say, Karen, you're a walking safety hazard, right? And there was a part of me that went, do you know how busy I am? And I only have 2 hands, which was their point, right? Of course. And of course, I thank them for the feedback because it's a safety conversation. Let me just say that. But, sometimes not always welcome in the moment. Sure, it's not, because you're kind of busy in service of something else where we'll be our first person to justify our own, position about things, right? But I wonder where feedback can be treated like other safety concerns and mechanisms, where in the same way as, and I mean, how many organizations up and down the country, all over the world, will say things like, well, we put a lid on our cup because we've got boiling liquid in it. And if anyone bumps into it, that is a walking hazard, as my colleague said to me that day, going up the stairs in the 4-inch heels. So what if we started taking feedback out of a very kind of HR-driven process that has, and there's a lot of conditions we put around that, some of which are very good, right? Like the recency impact, and we give feedback, particularly where it's challenging feedback one-to-one. So let's kind of say as a baseline, they are good things to do. But I think where feedback has maybe taken a wrong turn is it's been tied into a performance management process. And once something gets processized, well, then we get so caught up in didn't know how to say it. And then suddenly it was a week later, and then I was on a flight, or they were on holidays, and here we are a month later, and I don't know how to bring it up. Like again, I don't know about you, Lois, and frequently that's the type of thing that gets in the way, right? Because there's this kind of dominant logic of feedback is part of a process called managing performance. Well, what if feedback was 2 people or 5 people or 3 people having a conversation about what just happened? What if it was just that simple? And what if we began to think about, well, it's not whether I've sat down one-to-one, every month or every quarter. It's not that. It's, you did a great job today. Let's look at the bright spots, because we don't focus enough on the things that were brilliant. Let's harvest what went right so we can replicate that, because success always, always, always leaves clues. So let's have that part of feedback. Feedback doesn't mean you have to ring a lawyer in advance in order to kind of not get my words stated right. And somebody told me that in a session one day, that as a man about to give feedback to a woman, he would have to call the lawyer first. I nearly fell over. And in fact, I remember kind of the nature of the feedback was very innocuous. It wasn't something that you think, well, maybe that he was right. No, it was really, just normal. I would call normal stuff, standard of something not being quite where it needed to be, right? And And what if we used service? Because I think service of a common goal, service of a higher purpose, service of an outcome, like, I think that's such an underrated vehicle for having really candid conversation, particularly the ones that we feel a bit icky about. Feel, oh, I don't want to be judging somebody. This is not my way, highway. But this is about, it's the equivalent of putting the lid on the coffee cup before you go walking through the open plan office. So I think when we start getting it into that much more human relational space, and we take those best practices, because they're best practices for a reason, of being prepared and having good examples, but actually being open to a conversation that says, I didn't get this all 100% right. Right. And like I don't know if you're familiar with the after action review principle that would have kind of come from the military post maneuver. It's like, I love that. I love that as a forum for a team to get together on a no blame basis, and the key parties to walk back through, do what went well, have their due difference on the table, and actually have a conversation about, what success was in this particular case or instance. And that is such a powerful and an easy tool. I have another client that he calls it Fix It Friday forums. So the purpose of this on a Friday is the team come together to talk about the things that didn't quite go, and they're in a big transformation period at the time, that didn't quite go right, and they use their values to go, okay, let's look at how we handle this. And if we applied a values lens on this, and they have a value called One Team, and there's a lot of third parties involved in their work. So if we apply the lens of One Team here, well, actually, what lessons can we extract from this? And where have we really honoured that value along the way? And so it begins again to take the values off the wall and into something that is a repeatable asset that will keep us actually on the straight and narrow to becoming the team of the people who said we were going to be. So they're like really simple tools, and you don't have to call it. Sometimes nothing gets fixed in these forums, mind you, right? However, the purpose is to come together and go, well, actually, what can we learn from this? What if we apply these values, and in the spirit of that, how can we have this conversation? And it's a great way sometimes to have a degree of separation for both parties, right? Because then it's not about me and it's not about you. It's about what we've agreed is a common standard, right?
I've worked with many teams where we've talked about versions of this, but it does quite often require quite a shift, both from the leader and the team, to move away from, because it's fear, isn't it? People are frightened of being judged. They're frightened of being blamed. And so they don't want to face up to having to say, oh, actually, I didn't get that quite right. And it's much, much easier to try to push that onto somebody else or into a different place. But I think you've talked about the rise of the relatable leader. And I would say that this is the rise of the truly connected team.
I love that. The truly connected team.
Yeah.
And what I kind of happens for me on the inside, even as you say that, Lois, well, yes, because if a team is truly connected, part of the demonstration of that is the ability to stay in uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
And be okay that actually along the way they're going to be messy, right? And there are ways to navigate that, and that's healthy. And yes, of course, there might be a tension between your commercial and your finance. There's a natural healthy tension sometimes between technology and HR, right? Or right, indeed, any function, right? And go, well, that's okay, and let's find our way to put language on what we need to do in order to deliver, in order to get there more smoothly sometimes. Because it's not always because something has gone desperately wrong, is it? Or awry. It's more looking for where's that 1%? You know, the peloton analogy was very prevalent, wasn't it, kind of 10 years ago?
Yeah.
And you're looking for the 1%, and the 1% was rarely at the individual level. It was how the peloton supported the rider, wasn't it, with the greatest potential to get the gold, and how they worked their way through the different relays and the different parts of the cycle, so that we're in pole position to make the move at the right time, and and get the outcome. So I kind of like that deeply connected team, because I like the relational element of that, because a lot of the time, the numbers might have been hit, but it's kind of the bodies on the road kind of along the way, or the crutches that people are walking with, or the broken arm. It's not right.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's
and
the
so
cost?
repeating it then becomes a challenge, doesn't it? How do you sustain that? Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground in that, Caroline, which is brilliant. Could I ask you then, if you were able to just summarize what you think it takes to be a trailblazing leader today?
Yeah. You know what I think? I think this is about being who you say you are consistently, but not in isolation of your environment. So it's this recognition of, you're not a sole trader. You're not somebody who's operating in isolation of others. It is that pivot towards with and through others, and make that your tagline. Make that the identity that you want to be remembered for, because the people who deliver effectively with and through others, they're typically the people we point out and say, I want to be like them. Because other people will see they're both rising with your tide.
Thank you. I think that's beautifully summarized. So just before we close, Caroline, do you want to just let people know a little bit about the work that you do and where they can find you if they wanted to get in touch with you about any of the work that you're currently doing?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, thank you. I suppose, you introduced me as leadership consigliere at the beginning, and maybe I should just give a slight explanation of that, because it does conjure up certain movies, right?
It does, yeah.
And it is true to say that I think over time I probably do know where a few bodies are buried, not the physical ones, but the skeletons in the closets, etc. And the reason I describe myself in that way is it's the intersection between coach and mentor. Because coaching will always be about your development, and to a large degree I do a lot of coaching. And mentorship is very much drawing from past experiences and best practice, but it's always with the future in mind, with the past in mind. Whereas the consigliere kind of sits in the middle going, and what about now? What's the thing that we need to do? What's the conversation we absolutely have to have in order to make progress? And so sometimes it can feel like, a gentle exfoliation of the things we don't really want to talk about and go through. And that's really where I sit, because I love watching leaders and their teams, especially with their teams and their organizations, step into a possibility that they just did not think was even available to them. They didn't dare to even reach out for it, because they're stuck in some of these unspoken rhythms and patterns and blind spots. So the work that I do is really around looking at what gets in the way of sustainable performance. I have a lovely tool called a team alignment index that puts some science behind the routines, the behaviors, and why is it that when brilliant people come together, it doesn't always work as smooth as it might look on paper. So that's really what I do. You can call it coaching, you can call it team dynamics, you can call it whatever you wish. What's more interesting to me is the outcome that people look for. So my website is www.consciousleaders.ie. My email is caroline@consciousleaders.ie. You'll also find me on LinkedIn and all good social media outlets, Lois.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. And we will put those details into the show notes if people wish to get in touch. So I just want to say thanks again for guesting on the show today, and all those fabulous insights, which have been really, really interesting. It's been great. It's been great to talk to you, and I'm sure we will cross paths again at some point.
Thank you.
This is Leadership Trailblazers, and just remember that the way we led yesterday won't lead us into tomorrow.